This is Catholic Forum. I'm Bob Krebs. Todd Harra is an author and funeral director at his family business, McCreary and Harra Funeral Homes and Crematory in Wilmington, Delaware. He is the co-author of the Amazon best-selling books Mortuary Confidential, Undertakers Spill the Dirt, and Over Our Dead Bodies, Undertakers Lift the Lid. Recently he published a funeral history book. It's entitled Last Rites, The Evolution of the American Funeral, and I'm happy to welcome Todd Harra to Catholic Forum. Thanks for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me on, Bob. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to meet you. We're going to talk about your book and about your line of work. Before we do, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What did I miss in the introduction?
I think you covered most of it. I've been working at the family business for the past 19 years, so my whole professional life. We've been in business since 1911, so for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And I have a wife who works here in the diocese as a school teacher, and
great.
2 kids who attend Catholic school here in the diocese.
Awesome. Where does your wife teach?
St. Mary Magdalene.
Oh, great. Mm-hmm. Perfect. And your kids go to school there as well?
They do.
That's great. Thank you for your support, and thank you for your wife's support, too, because we couldn't do it without our great school teachers.
Well, it's a great community.
My next question is how did you get interested in being a funeral director? But it's just passed down from generation to generation in your family, pretty much.
It is. My family's been doing this since before the Civil War. Yeah. My great-great-great-grandfather was the cabinet maker in Milford, Delaware. And back then they were called tradesmen undertakers because undertaking was not a full-time position. You were a carpenter, maybe a joiner, a chandler, or a cabinet maker, and your vocation lent itself to being the town's undertaker. So when there would be a death in the town, people would take over a piece of string, and James White would make a custom coffin for that person. And that's how the family got into the business. And his son took over the business, and his wife, so Isaac was James's son, and his wife was Rachel, and she owned a millinery shop in the town of Milford. So she was a woman who was very much ahead of her time. Having a millinery shop, she knew how to sew, and Isaac's vocation was a carpenter. So Isaac would build the coffins for the town of Milford, and Rachel would sew the interiors. So it was very much a husband and wife vocation. Mm-hmm. Now, there was a couple generation lapse. I work for my uncle, so it's not the typical father to son generational thing that you see in a lot of family-owned funeral homes. And now, this day and age, you should say father to daughter, because over 75% of all graduating mortuary classes are female. So we're seeing a lot of women coming into the profession.
Interesting.
But after college, I was, looking for a job, and I asked my uncle, can I start, working part-time for you? I just, need to make some money, frankly, and just really grew to love the work and love what I do, and here I am today. Yeah.
Well, obviously you love it. Not only are you doing it, but you're also writing about it. But what do you like most out of from being a funeral director? What's your favorite part?
I'm going to answer that by telling you something I hear on almost a daily basis. People come up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, how can you do what you do? It's got to be so depressing." And my answer to that is there's a lot of jobs where you could look at it like that. A doctor only sees people when they're sick. A police officer only sees people typically when they're having a bad day. Mm-hmm. And an accountant only sees people when it's tax season, right? So you're seeing people at a time in their lives when they may not be at their best, and we're seeing people when they're at a time of crisis, time of grief, and as a funeral director, it's really a blessing for me that I'm able to walk beside people during perhaps what might be one of the most troubling times, the most difficult times in their life, and help them try to find a way forward. The funeral, I think, is the first step somebody takes in their grief journey towards healthy grieving and moving on after the loss of a loved one. And how many people can say they're making a difference in people's lives, and they get to see that in a very real, tangible, and transformative way every day. So, I consider myself very blessed to do what I do and to be able to make an impactful, meaningful difference in people's lives.
I could see where that could be very rewarding. And then you also write. I mean, this is your third book. How did you get started in writing? Is it something that you've always liked to do?
It's something I've always enjoyed doing, and I would say maybe 15 years ago, a colleague of mine who has a mortuary in Long Beach, California, came to me with this idea. And I knew him through work with a breast cancer foundation that he started. And he had this idea for raising money for his breast cancer foundation that he had collected 50 stories from funeral directors across the country, some poignant, some humorous, kind of a look into what we do as funeral directors, and said, I don't have the skill set to write this book. Would you write it with me? So we wrote the book that eventually became Mortuary Confidential, and that's how I kind of got into the whole world of writing, through writing this book to benefit Ken's Breast Cancer Foundation.
Wow. And so tell us about this latest book, Last Rites. How did that come about?
That came about, somebody gave me a book called Bellevue, 3 Centuries of Medicine and Mayhem at America's Most Storied Hospital by David Oshinsky. And they gave me this book because we had done our embalming labs at Bellevue. I went to a mortuary school in Manhattan, and that's where we did our embalmings, and thought I'd be interested in the book because of the place. And, I got the book, and I'm thinking, great, a book about a hospital. How interesting can this be? And I was wrong. It was a fascinating exploration of how modern medicine kind of came to be. And I remember thinking after I completed the book that, wow, this has, really been enlightening for someone like me as a layperson who knows nothing about medicine. And my next thought was, nobody's done this for funeral service. I could do this for funeral service. So I set out to write Last Rites as kind of my homage to this book, and to lay out the funeral rite for people in a way that wasn't scary, because I'm taking historic evidence and showing them this is why we do this. And I tell people, I wrote this book. The readership I had in mind was my mom, somebody who knows very little about the funeral profession, but could sit down and enjoy this book and learn a few things, and it not be an intimidating experience.
You write in the book that the Civil War was kind of a pivotal point in the history of American funeral evolution. Why is that? What happened during the Civil War?
The short answer is Lincoln's funeral. Before the Civil War, the kind of American funeral experience, I think, is best summed up as one kind of great simplicity, but it was great excess. And the excess wasn't in where you would see funeral costs coming into play today. The excess was in the repast, so what we would call the funeral luncheon today, as well as funeral gifts. So 95% of the funeral expense in colonial America comprised those two pieces, pretty much. The repast, you think about it, colonial roads, it was very, kind of dangerous at that time, tough to travel. So people that came to funerals expected to be refreshed by their hosts. So people would break out their finest foods, things that were rare and precious, sugar. They'd slaughter their hogs, and they'd put on this great feast, and they'd break out their stocks of booze. And the expense of this was just immense. And, there's historic evidence of families opening a butt of wine, and that's a barrel size, and it's 126 gallons. So they would, provide libations for the funeral goers, and put themselves in financial peril at this. And the other piece would be the funeral gifts. In the colonial funeral, there was the tradition of giving dule, and that comes from the Latin word dolio, which means to grieve. So the family was giving something in grief, essentially, and they were expected to give luxury goods, gold rings, scarves, gloves, books, wine, things that were hard to obtain and very expensive. And so this is where you see the cost of the colonial funeral was in these two things: the repast and the mourning gifts. We see all these changes that occur, for a number of reasons. People start moving into the cities because of the Industrial Revolution, and then Lincoln's funeral happens and sets the stage for, essentially the traditional American funeral that we have today, which would be marked by viewing of the body, public notification of the community, a religious service, burial, so inhumation, and permanent memorialization. So essentially erecting a headstone in a cemetery.
Interesting. And President Lincoln was the first to kind of make all that stuff popular.
Yes. I tell people when I do my program on Lincoln's funeral that Lincoln's funeral did not invent any of these things per se, but his funeral was on such a grand scale and so many people witnessed it that it afterwards it was the template essentially for the American funeral experience after the Civil War.
Yeah. So walk us through your book.
So the first chapter is essentially my theory or my hypothesis that Lincoln's funeral set the stage for the American funeral, and all the elements that go with that. The popularity of embalming. Now think about it, Bob. 3% of America's population viewed the president's body. Okay, during his grand funeral journey, and some of these people were viewing him 2.5 weeks after he had been assassinated, and to them it was almost as if a magic trick had occurred. Seeing his body there, no trauma and no decomposition 2.5 weeks after he had been assassinated. People were amazed, and the thought became, if it's good enough for the president, then it's good enough for me.
Right.
So we see embalming soar in popularity after Lincoln's funeral. The prominence of the casket or coffin. Lincoln had a coffin which in today's money would be $25,000, paraded in front of millions of people in the 11 cities it stopped during the funeral journey. Same with the hearse. Prominence of the hearse. After Lincoln's funeral, we see the popularity and the use of the hearse explode. Each city during Lincoln's funeral tried to outdo itself to create a more grand vehicle to convey Lincoln from the train depot to where they were going to have his viewing. So we have this prominence of the hearse, flower offerings. Prior to the Civil War and the colonial funeral experience, people, essentially would gather wildflowers, as people have always offered flowers to kind of surround the ugliness of death with something beautiful. During Lincoln's funeral, we see these set pieces or flowers arranged to look like something else, a cross, an anchor, a star, something patriotic. So flower offerings became kind of the norm in the Victorian mourning experience. Postmortem photography soars after Lincoln's photographed in New York City. And then we also have what I call the habiliments of woe or mourning garb. Immediately after the Civil War, we see this period of where Americans, mostly women, have these very rigid rules of essentially wearing black when a family member dies. And Mary Lincoln put on mourning when the president was assassinated and never took it off until she died 17 years after the president was assassinated. So After that, I kind of break it down by eras that influence the American funeral experience. The Roman era was very influential on the modern American funeral. As far as this is the one time in history when we have an undertaker who's secular, who's not part of a religious sect. And everything else that kind of the Romans contributed to the modern funeral experience. Interestingly enough, gladiators came out of funerals. Originally, long before the Colosseum was built, the final day of the post-funeral celebration was gladiatorial combat.
Oh. I'm glad we kind of got away from that.
Yeah, that's right. That is one piece that is
we don't
not
miss
carried
that.
forward. Looking at obviously the Egyptians, kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and
Right.
the kind of embalming contributions, and then segueing into medieval Europe and how the barber surgeons kind of took that Egyptian knowledge, or what they thought that Egyptian knowledge was, and translated forward into kind of some early attempts at embalming, which is different than mummification. And I go through all that in the text. And then I talk about the early American, kind of the colonial funeral experience, as well as the Civil War, the Victorian mourning experience, the changes brought forth by World War I, and also looking at some pieces of the American funeral that people are typically curious about. Casket/coffin, the hearse, as well as burial vaults.
Wow. Seems like you've covered everything. When you did your research for this book, is there anything that surprised you? Like, gee, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Or did you already kind of know all of this?
No. There's a lot of little Easter eggs I uncovered. I would say the two that kind of stand out to me is the first one. I mentioned the percentage of women that are coming into the profession now. You know, what's new, what's old is new. Women, I found out way back in the colonial period, in addition to the tradesmen undertakers who would supply the coffin, the women were called layers out of the dead. And so they would be called upon. The town would typically have one. She would usually double as the midwife for the town. So the midwife would be the layer out of the dead, and she would be called upon when a townsperson would die to wash and anoint and dress that person while the coffin was being made. So I was surprised to learn that little tidbit about women in early funeral service here in America. And the other thing was kind of this little chapter of American history that's been swept under the rug that led to the advent of the burial vault, the resurrectionists. Prior to people donating their body to science, medical schools would obtain most of their cadavers by this group of men who would illegally dig people up and essentially sell their remains to medical science. So doctors could study anatomy on cadavers, and that's something that came across the Atlantic from Europe. That was an issue in Europe as well. But the whole resurrectionist leading to the advent of the burial vault was something that they really didn't touch on in mortuary history and in mortuary school. Yeah.
Interesting. We could go on talking about this for hours because it is a fascinating subject, and we're all touched by it sooner or later. But I want to just kind of go off topic for a little bit. You were recently confirmed into the Catholic Church.
Yes.
At the Easter Vigil, correct?
I was, yes.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
Tell us about that. How did that come about?
So really, it's been a transformative experience spiritually for me. My background is I was raised Presbyterian, and like a lot of people, my faith lapsed and went into a period of questioning. And I read about these people that kind of have these epiphanies, and I'm kind of jealous of that because that's God saying to you, this is what you need to do. Right. Here's a clear sign. It was a little bit more subtle for me. I've been married 16 years now and have attended Mass with my wife for most of those 16 years. So it was more of God speaking to me quietly and the voice getting louder and louder and saying, this is something you need to do. And it was a little over a year ago. I think it was the summer before last. At lunch, I said to my wife, I said, I'm going to convert to Catholicism. It's time. I'm ready. And she, of course, was happy about it. But I would say my takeaway from the entire process and where I am now is that I realized, when you're in a period of questioning, I think God actually draws you closer to Him than maybe somebody who's practicing their faith daily. But what I've realized is, I now have a more clear communication with God than I did before, regardless of how close He is. I can now speak to Him better.
You have a framework, kind of.
I do.
That.
Yes.
I think that's what you're driving at. That's you do have this 2,000-year history and this framework, and welcome to the club.
Oh, thank you.
So how can we get a copy of the book?
It's sold in all places where fine books are sold. If you do have a local bookstore, I certainly encourage you to support the mom and pop shops. If not, Barnes & Noble is a fine place to pick one up, or online.
Well, the book is titled The Evolution of the American Funeral, and it's called, Last Rites is the main title, The Evolution of the American Funeral by Todd Harra. Pick up a copy. It makes a great gift, and it's certainly a very interesting topic. Todd, thanks so much for being with us today.
Great. Thank you. It was a pleasure.